we're going to look at the difference between parameters and arguments. And we're going to have several examples. We'll start with a function and show you how they're used in the context of that right on this slide, but then I'm going to quickly run over to Python and do things in a coding environment. My goal is to have enough examples here today so that when you finish this, you'll definitely know the difference between parameters and arguments. So let's dive in. So the first example here is a function that's been built. We named it add, ADD, and in parentheses, we're passing two values, A and B. A and B are parameters. Parameters can be thought of symbolic names that are associated with values. So we build this function called add, pull in two parameters A and B, and when we run the function, it's going to take A plus B. Well, we can't add A and B together because they're letters, but when they're symbolically representing values, then it'll work. And down below here, when we run the function, we'll define it up here, and it's somewhere in our code, and then we finally want to use it. We type in add, and then in parentheses, we're going to put our arguments. Those are the values. And those arguments themselves will be passed right into the function, and that function will work, and it'll return the value of 5. So if that still didn't quite make sense to you, hang on, I got you covered. So we are going to jump into Python. So Python is where I code a lot, and I'm going to first use something called sum. Sum is a function. It's pre-built inside this environment. It already knows what to do. It says, hey, pass in some numbers and I'll sum them up for you. So if we try to pass in the letter P, P is not associated with anything. It doesn't know what to do with P. If we run this, it's going to argue with us and say, hey, P is not defined. Okay, well that makes sense because the sum function needs numbers. So I'll just pull in 1, 2, and 5. So we've got a string of numbers or an array, and now it knows what to do. It says, oh, okay, I take 1 plus 2 plus 5 and I make that equal to 8. So are these arguments? Yes. They are arguments because they're passing directly into the function, and the function knows what to do with them, and they're not defined by a symbolic name. Let me show you some more. Let's go down below to the next cell. Here we have b is equal to 3 and 5, and we already know what this function is. It adds things up. Well, let's say that we wanted Python to not recognize this line of code. And we just do that by placing a hashtag in front of it. If we run it, we know that we're going to get an error. Okay, we've already learned that above. So if we get rid of our hashtag, let Python see that code, it's going to know to take 5 and 3 and add it in. Okay, so what's the parameter? The parameter is b. It's the symbolic name for the arguments, and the arguments are the values. The values are 3 and 5. Okay, I'm going to show you something. Let's go to help for the sum function. And just like anything, when you're looking at functions, you're often going to be looking in the help area. And this says, hey, there's parameters that can be passed inside of the sum function. And a is the first parameter. In this particular function, we can actually have that parameter not necessarily be called a. We can change everything to a, and it works perfectly. But this particular function would allow us to change that first parameter value to whatever we would like, and it runs. That's not the case with all the functions, and we'll look at that in just a second. But nonetheless, let's scroll down and look at another example. Okay, here we're going to define x as equal to 4 and 98, and then we're going to sum up x. So what's the parameter? The parameter is x. And what are the arguments? The arguments are 4 and 98, and that equals to 102. Another example. A is equal to 3, b is equal to 6, y is equal to a plus b, and then when we run this code cell, y will print out what the resulting value is. What are the arguments? 3 and 6. What are the parameters? A and b. So y is equal to the parameters of a and b. The The parameters are symbolic names associated with something. A is equal to 3, B is equal to 6, so Y is equal to 3 plus 6, and when we run this, we'll get 9. So let's one up this a little bit, make it a little bit more difficult. We're going to scroll down here and run this code, and it's a little bit more complicated. Let me just read it real quickly for you. We've defined a variable called AX, which is equal to a box plot. Okay, so it's going to be pulling up a graph, and box plot is in itself a function, and inside a box plot, that function itself can call for a number of parameters and their associated arguments. So X is a parameter, and it's going to be equal to P class. P class is the set of data. Let me show you what that looks like. If I run the data, sorry about that, we will see that P class is and has a number of integers associated with it. So those are the integers or values associated with X, and X is the parameter. Y is the parameter, is equal to age, another set of data. A hue is equal to the parameter, and data is equal to the parameter. And these are the associated values that we're passing, which in this case are going to be the arguments. And if we actually go look at the help for this particular function, you'll see that it has in it the parameters that we just talked about, and in this order: X, Y, hue, and data. Okay, so we have this function running with those things in order, and when we run this thing, it works great. We're not going to talk about the graph, that's a whole nother subject. But I want to point out something. Because these are all placed in the correct order, often you'll see in functions when they're running is they're just going to remove the parameters, which are the symbolic names. And this will still run. Okay? There's our box plot. But I want to show you something. When we don't have the parameters defined in terms of their associated symbolic names, and we get this out of order, I'm just going to move the data set to be the third item and this hue to be the fourth item. The data set is supposed to be the fourth item, but now that I put it as the third item within our function and we try to run it, it's going to argue with us and say, hey, there's an error. So the point I'm trying to make with this is that when you have a function, you'll often see people having the parameter or the symbolic names in there and it associated with their associated values, where you see, like, originally we had X is equal to P class. We'll put in the rest of the parameters in here, we'll run it, and I'll show you that it'll actually run this time because we are using our parameters, and this was hue is equal to sex, and then I'll run this and it runs again. Okay, so hopefully this was helpful for you. Thank you so much for watching.